furniture, and it's furniture that a lot of people would like to have in their house. And they fill your house, and all of a sudden they take pictures of your place, and it looks completely different than the day before when you moved out. They have staged the setting. That's what Luke chapter 1 is all about. On Christmas Day, we'll be in Luke chapter 2, but today we are in the staging setting. Some of you might have enjoyed last week where we talked about a puzzle. I'm trying my best to give you an illustration that you think about over time. Someone asked me this week, what happens to the puzzle? Well, in my house, here's what happens to puzzles. When a puzzle is done, we go and get something called Mod Podge or white glue. For some of you a little older, we put white glue and Mod Podge all over it, and we set it up, and so it dries, and so it becomes what was once a bunch of random pieces becomes a picture that we can hang on the wall. I said to Julie this morning before church, I said, that's what her and I, at least, I hope maybe some of you will participate, that our life will be pictures for all to see. It was once a great hodgepodge, so to speak, of just random pieces. But the jigsaw puzzle of our life, God puts it all together so that we can declare in Romans chapter 8 and 28, for all things work together for good to them that love God, to those that are called according to his purposes. When we look back, we are viewing what God has put together in each and every one of our lives. And that's what you see in the book of Luke and the first chapter. There was a lot of preparation that went into play in order for us to get to Luke chapter 2, but that's for another day. Because in Luke chapter 1, you begin to read about the way that we set ourselves up is the way that we will be able to finish strong. By saying that, so often in this time and season, I'm watching people, they say, well, I'm going into debt, and I don't like Christmas because my credit cards just seem to run up to levels that I just did not expect them to. And I want to suggest to you to just pause. Just pause. Pause on the spending. Because so often, even this morning, it was interesting. My granddaughter and I are driving to church. It's real early. And the Chinook Center Mall is already half full by the time that we pass by on the way to church, because people are trying to get a good parking spot so they can go and spend money, maybe money that they don't have. But maybe we need to stop and think about and set the stage for our lives rather than just spend. Maybe we need to just sit for a moment and learn to enjoy the moment. Because a lot of times you can give me the best of gifts, or I can give you the best of gifts. But if all of a sudden I find myself where my attitude is all out of whack and I'm not having a whole lot of fun in life and things get said and things get displayed, then all of a sudden it doesn't matter what the gift is and it doesn't matter how much it costs, because everything about the moment seems to be ruined. And that's what I want us to look at this morning very quickly from the word of the Lord, is in Luke chapter 2. Because at the appropriate time, as the Apostle Paul declares in the book of Galatians, at the appropriate time, at the appointed time, at the Kairos moment, God sent forth his Son so that in the fullness of time, there would be a redeeming that could happen so that we could experience grace today, so that we could experience mercy like we've never, ever, ever experienced it or deserved it. Luke chapter 1 talks about a man by the name of Zechariah. Zechariah was married to a lady by the name of Elizabeth, and an angel of the Lord appeared to Zechariah one day, and this word that was there at that moment in time began to resonate in Zechariah's heart and change the way his life was. In Luke chapter 1, you'll see it on the screen. We begin in verse 5. It says, in the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zacharias of the division of Abijah, and he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth, verse 6. And both, it says, were righteous. Everybody say righteous. And both were righteous in God's sight, living in all of the commandments and requirements of the Lord. In the days of Herod of Judea. Herod was a crafty and a cruel man. The historical family line for Herod was that he came from the line of Esau, and you go all the way back to the first time you saw Esau, and Esau was a crafty and cruel man, and the generational thread that you see in this family now comes to display in Herod of Judea. But all of a sudden, this priest, in the midst of everything that's going on, finds himself living righteously when other things were not being made righteous. It's to be noted this morning that it says both Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth were both righteous in the sight of God. But there was something that was missing. They were righteous before God, but they were missing something in the now. And it says in verse 7 that their family line was such that it was only Zacharias and Elizabeth. They found themselves with no children. Verse 7 says that Elizabeth could not conceive, and yet it gave another excuse for potentially why there was no conception, and that was that both of them, it says, were well advanced. They were getting a little older. I wonder what the feeling was at that moment in time. This feeling, this sense of, I've missed out. Maybe someone under the sound of my voice in this place is feeling, I've missed out. Time is passing me by. I'm never going to experience everything that I thought I was going to experience because time just goes by so fast. But here's Zechariah. His name actually means Jehovah has remembered. Seems ironic that his name means Jehovah has remembered, and yet in the midst of it, he wasn't remembered in the place of his deep disappointment. But then you look at the name of Elizabeth, and her name means God is an absolute reliable one. It's amazing to think that she lived under the banner of God is an absolute reliable one, and yet disappointment. How do you handle disappointment? Well, the amazing thing is that we serve a God who does the impossible. That when I can't figure it out, I come to this place in the midst of all of my stuff, and I hear the whisper of heaven which says, with God, nothing is impossible. The amazing thing that I find about this story is so much different than my life, because my life, if I don't get what I want, there is an ache inside of my heart, and that ache inside of my heart sometimes comes out, it's vocalized to those that I feel safe enough to vocalize it with, and it's called disappointment. But it always starts with a potential complaint. I wish this had happened. I wish that had happened. When I read the staging of the birth of Jesus and I see Zacharias and Elizabeth in Luke chapter 1, it's amazing to think that in the midst of their hurt and their pain, there was no complaining. Wow. Maybe today I need to evaluate that which I allow to come out of my own heart and my own life, and to recognize that even in the midst of whatever may be going on, I can trust God. But I don't feel like it oftentimes. Seems like there's a better way. God, would you just give me everything that I want at this moment? Every whim, every wish. These people had needs. The need was that they wanted a family. They wanted a baby. It was a need that they couldn't take care of by themselves, because it says that Elizabeth couldn't conceive and they were well on in years, so Zechariah couldn't give Elizabeth what she needed. And so there was no human answer to this situation except to sit right in the midst of the disappointment. But then God. How many times do we discount what God can do on our behalf because we think that our situation right now is such that it won't allow us to experience, and we can't figure it out on our own strength, and we can't put all the pieces together, and we truly need God to show up at that moment. Well, there's an interesting principle here that sometimes when we're in the place of disappointment that we forget. But it was in that place where Zechariah and Elizabeth came where they said, okay, God, we don't discount the current situation. And we know we have a need that only you can meet. And so we just bring it to you. Maybe that's where you're at this morning in this place. You've got a need you can't meet. You can't take care of it in your own strength. But maybe in this moment in time, you can just whisper that little prayer. Lord, I bring this to you. You know, God has the ability to honor mustard seed faith. So I'm not asking you to try harder. I'm not asking you to pray louder. I'm just asking you to come with that which you have and begin to allow God to continue to work on your behalf. The amazing part you'll see on the front of your bulletin, why don't you take that? There's a picture on the front of your bulletin, and it says, Lord, help my unbelief. What happened at that moment? I've preached this so many times, but the rearrangement of this story has been in the last season of time. My wife said to me one day, can you see what happened in this story? And I said, yes. At first, I saw just what I wanted to see, what I'd always thought. The story was that a man comes to Jesus and said, Jesus, I have a need. And what does Jesus do? He takes care of the need. But so often we think we have to earn our way, try harder, give more, become more. But Jesus didn't say to this man, have more faith. Because here's the interesting part of this story, and we'll develop this in 2025. The interesting part of Jesus healing when this man didn't have enough faith was that Jesus healed so that the man could have faith. So often we get it rearranged like it's all about us. Like we have to pull it all off. But the amazing thing about Zechariah and Elizabeth is that they couldn't do anything in their own strength. They were out of resources. They couldn't turn back the clock. They couldn't make their bodies do anything different than they were doing at that moment in time. It would take a bare miracle. And you begin reading in verse 8, 9, 10, and 11. It says that Zechariah was doing his duty in the house of the Lord. And all of a sudden, while doing that duty, he had taken his need to God. God knew exactly where he was at. God knew the disappointment in their heart and life. And it says in verse 11 that an angel of the Lord appeared to Zacharias, standing to the right of the altar of incense. An angel of the Lord. And that's all I want to unpack this morning for you in this text. An angel of the Lord shows up in the midst of all of the disappointment. And at that point in time, says to Zacharias, I hear, I've heard, I know. What do you do when you're in the midst of seasons of life where you can't make it all work the way you thought it could? I bet you Zacharias and Elizabeth went through times of discouragement. I wonder if this will ever end. I bet you they went through times of potential doubt. Am I truly believing this right thing that I say I'm supposed to be believing? I bet you they even went through the moment of disbelief. And yet in the midst of it, when I see the staging for the gospel story in Luke chapter 2, I see two people who in the midst of the circumstances, I see two people who in the midst of the scenario that they were in that was disappointing, who they potentially were full of doubt and despair, they pushed through. They said, God, I'm going to give this to you, and I'm going to trust that you will take care of it on my behalf. Verse 13 gives us a description of what the angel said to Zacharias. It says, but the angel said to Zacharias, do not be afraid, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear a son, and you will give him the name John. As I've been reading this text over the last while, I read around it and try and figure out questions. I wonder what if questions. The angel appears. Zechariah is being faithful to do what he's called to do. He's walking through despair and discouragement potentially, and an angel says, do not be afraid. He must have exhibited some kind of fear. But I wonder, even prior to that, wonder what could have happened if Zechariah had become bitter and angry. I wonder if he would have said, God, I'm giving you my 2 weeks notice. I'm turning it in. I'm not trusting you anymore. It's amazing because all of us go through those things. We don't like to admit it. We go through seasons. They're calling it now in our time and season deconstruction, where people are deconstructing their faith. And whatever title you want to give it, we all have to go through that time and see, are we going to believe and trust, or are we going to take it all apart and figure it all out in our own strength? Well, I promise you this, that when I understand that with God all things are possible, I recognize that I may not always figure it all out. Here's Zechariah. His name means God, the Jehovah, has remembered. And here's Elizabeth. God is the absolute reliable one. And yet they're standing in the midst of an unmet need. Wow. Which brings us to a twist in the story. Because yes, an angel shows up. And yes, he brings comfort, and he says to Zechariah, do not be afraid, for God has heard your prayer. And this is what God's going to do because you prayed. God is going to exert his power in the impossible and provide a child where there was no child in human terms possible. And in verse 14, the angel says to Zechariah, and there will be joy, and there will be delight and gladness, and many will rejoice because the God who does impossible is about to make this possible. And the angel begins to describe in verse 15 and onwards just what this young man will become. It says he will be filled with the Holy Spirit from his mother's womb, and he will turn many of the children of Israel under righteousness. And verse 17, and he will go before him in the Spirit, speaking about he will be the forerunner to the Christ. Now you would think, to stop for a moment in the story, because you would think at this moment, after all of the years of praying, after all of the years of asking, of hoping that God would come through on your behalf, you would think that at this moment in time, Zechariah would fall on his knees or at least take a posture and get so excited that finally God has answered my prayer and God's going to come through. You would think that he would find this moment where he could just come to this place and say, wow, God has come through on my behalf. But Zechariah does what I oftentimes do. I hear a word from the Lord, and I say to God, are you sure? See, the angel of the Lord had brought news from heaven and said to Zechariah, I've heard your prayer. Your wife, who you want to have a baby, is going to have a baby, no matter even if you're old or she's old. And what does Zechariah say in verse 11 when he hears this good news? Instead of getting all excited, he does what I do oftentimes. He questions. He says back to the angel, how, verse 18, how can I know this? But it wasn't just how can I know this. Scripture says, how can I know this for sure? It was like Zechariah is starting to have this conversation with the angel and say, come on, quit joking. This is a joke, right? Look at me. I can't do this. Look at my wife. She's too old for this. And yet you said God has heard my prayer. Couldn't he have heard my prayer 35 years ago when it would have been a lot easier and we could have just explained it away? For that's what he says. How can I know this for sure? For I am an old man, and my wife, he was a bright husband. He calls himself old and says his wife is just advanced. Because a dumb husband would say, I'm old and she's old. But here's the point. Zechariah finds himself at this moment in time positioning himself at one of the first places in Scripture that you ever see the question. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 1, it says that the serpent came to a lady by the name of Eve, and he implanted a question. And the question was this: did God really say? That question has reverberated down through history. It touches my life because I hear a word, I get a promise, and I get all excited for a minute, and then I say, is it actually true? That place of doubt. That's what the serpent put before Eve, and Eve grasped that question, and she began to question, well, did God really say? And here's Zechariah hearing the word from heaven, and all of a sudden, he says, are you sure? Don't play with me on this one. I'm too old. I'm too fragile. I've been too disappointed all through time. Don't do this to me. And it was like Zechariah put a question mark where God had put an exclamation mark. How many times do I do that in my life? Verse 19 of Luke chapter 1 says, the reply, I am Gabriel, the one who stands in the presence of God. And I was sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. This is the reply to the question, are you sure? Are you certain? How can I know? Gabriel says, I am here with a message that comes from heaven, and it is distinctly just for you. I don't know why the next part happens, but verse 20 says that because Zechariah didn't believe, the angel says, you know what? I'm going to close up your mouth for a short season of time until this baby is actually born. And so from that moment of expressing disbelief, doubt, are you sure, God? Don't play with me in this. Okay, Zacharias, I'm going to let you sit with that statement for the next number of months. Verse 21 and verse 22, you can read the story at your leisure. All of a sudden, the people outside are waiting for Zechariah to come out from this place in the sanctuary of God. And he's experienced this voice from heaven, and he's expressed his own opinion and his own doubt. And now he comes out and he says nothing. There comes a place for all of us where it has to come full circle in terms of what we're going to believe. Oftentimes, we find ourselves in positions where we can't take care of it ourselves. But we serve a God who does the impossible. And he comes to us with a word this morning, and it's a word just for you, it's a word for me. He says, trust and obey, for there's no other way. To be happy in Jesus, just to trust and obey. You go down to verse 57 through 64, and all of a sudden it says, keep in mind that Zechariah has been mute. He can't say it. He's stuck with these words in his mouth of the doubt. Are you sure, God? And then it says in verse 57, now the time had come for Elizabeth to give birth. And she gave birth to a son. And then her neighbors and her relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they rejoiced with her. Verse 59, and when they came to circumcise the child on the 8th day, they were going to name him Zechariah after his father. But, thank God for mamas. But his mother said, no, his name shall be called John. Everyone else had a name for this child. But Elizabeth had heard the word of the Lord. She had believed the promise. And no matter what anyone else called this child, she had heard that word from God that said, you shall name him John. And she held on to that place. And for 9 months, she called this child, this miracle within her, what God had said to call. And she, at that point in time, no matter what the opinion was, you should do this, you should name him that, he should be this. No. His name is John. And in the midst of it, Zechariah is still not talking. But he's hearing everyone else say what this child's name should be. And Zechariah asks for a tablet. And as he got that tablet, he wrote on that tablet, his name is not going to be what you call him. His name will be called John. Zechariah says, I doubted once, but now I know God has come through. And because God has said, this I will follow. And in verse 64, it says, and immediately his mouth was opened, and his tongue was loosed, and he began to speak in praise unto God. I wonder, as I see the stage being set, how often I hear the word of the Lord and question. I wonder how often, in the midst of despair, I find that God comes and he says something to me. It could be through someone else. It could be through opening up this sacred book. It could be just something that just pops, and I get that promise. But then I say, I'm not really sure. That's been the pattern of my life. Maybe you can identify with that as well. We get a promise and we say, God, is this really you? As I read this story, it doesn't say too much about Elizabeth except that she believed God. It says that she held on to the promise of God. And as I read this story, I say, Lord, I want to be like Elizabeth. That when you speak promises over my life, I choose to hold on to them and believe them. For with God, nothing is impossible. And you might be here today, and you gave up hope a long time ago, because now you're well advanced in years. Now time has gone by. Now you find yourself in a place where you can't put it together. It is such a disaster or a mess. You can't figure it all out. But you know what you can do? You can trust and pray and come with me to Jesus and say, Jesus, would you hear the request of my heart? He's the one who sympathizes with our weaknesses. He's the one who cares for us when we're cast down. He's the one who hears. And just like Zechariah and Elizabeth, they said a prayer and God answered. But it took a long time. The question I'm asking myself is, what am I going to do between now and then? My prayer for myself this morning is found in this place. I said, God, help me to trust when I don't understand. Help me to believe when the facts don't add up. Help me to hold on to what you've said over my life, so that in my life, no matter what's going on around me, I can find that place of peace. And in that place of peace, know that you are completely in control. We talked last week about the puzzles of life, and how often you cannot determine a puzzle by one or two little pieces. I watched my son last night roll out one of his early Christmas presents. It was only a 1,000-piece puzzle. And I remember when it was bought, we stood, his mom and I and Savannah, we stood in front of this display case full of these puzzles, and we deliberately tried to find the one that would be the hardest to put together. And as he sat on the floor last night and began to put it all together, I thought to myself, I'm sure glad he doesn't quit, because the picture's not done until it's all put together. Because you can't just take one little piece of a 1,000-piece puzzle and say, oh, there's the picture. No, that's just one. But so often in our lives, we define our lives by just one little piece. My life's a disaster. My life is a sunken ship. My life is filled with so much hurt and pain. And yes, all of those things could be true in that, but let's watch God put the puzzle together. You look at Zechariah and Elizabeth. If you just define their life by their loss and by their disappointment, that wasn't the end, though. But you could define their life by that. But God had so much more. And God has so much more for you today. So much more for me. Would you allow Him to continue to work? And would you continue to trust? And as you continue to trust and see what God will do, all of the pieces come together, so that it can become a beautiful picture of God's grace in your life and in my life when it's all done and finished. So that when it's all done and finished, whenever that might be, we can say, all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purposes. All things. Not all things are good, but all things he works for his good in our lives, so that we can experience the immense grace that he comes to bring in each and every one of our hearts and lives. Don't define your life by one piece in the puzzle. Let God continue to put it together for you. Let's all stand.